HYAS is a Canadian cybersecurity company. We have clients all over the world, from Fortune 5 through governments and law enforcement, all the way down through small law firms and others. Happy to report that at least one of the gold sponsors is actually a client today, at least one. I won't name who. But I wanted to talk today a little bit more generically about cybersecurity, and specifically about this notion of cyber resiliency. And so we will go through and talk about how attacks work. We will go through and talk about how a set of anonymous customers implement these kinds of things as part of their security stack. But I'm not going to go into HYAS specifically or anything else. If you have questions, you're welcome to either ask or email me anytime afterwards, and I'm happy to talk specifically about HYAS or expand on any of the other topics that I've raised today. So I want to start off and talk about resiliency, and not even in the cybersecurity space, but in a human body example, right? So how does resiliency in the human body work? Well, we have skin, we have, nose hair, we have other things to keep bad stuff out from our body. But the human body is specifically designed knowing that bad stuff is going to get in, and that bad stuff maybe that I've never even seen before as a system. And, we have white blood cells that root out, and something bad is in there, and I've never seen it before, but let's figure out how we attack it and kill it before it kills us. Right? And so while the human body is built so that to try and keep bad stuff out, it's also designed knowing that that's impossible. And it's designed knowing that when bad stuff gets in, we need to have a mechanism to very quickly identify it, stop it, and kill it before it kills us. Right? And so if the human body's designed like that, why aren't IT systems designed like that in that exact same way? Because when cybersecurity first got started, 30 years ago, right? It was, let's set up 4 walls around our organization. Let's set up 4 walls around our devices. That's how we'll keep bad people out. Well, I'm sorry to say, but the days of they can't get in, the days of I'm too small, I'm not a target, the days of I'm fully protected, they're over. Full stop. If a bad actor wants to get into your environment, they will get in. There's a variety of different ways that they do this. Happy to talk about what the NSA, is talking about patching systems. Lots of people get in through supply chain attacks or through third-party vendors that are connected to your system that maybe you didn't even realize, right? If a bad actor wants in, they're gonna get in. But the good news is that doesn't mean that their attack still has to be effective. It doesn't mean that once that bad actor gets in, that they will necessarily steal data, that they will necessarily encrypt your data, that they'll necessarily cause financial harm. Just because Sally in accounting gets phished, and even though she's been through the training, she accidentally clicks on the link, that doesn't mean that bad stuff has to happen. When that malware gets into the organization, it doesn't mean bad stuff has to happen. That's that notion of cyber resiliency. And I appreciate the polling question. Super happy to see so many people answer it correctly. This is a direct quote from the US government, an organization called Defense Acquisition University, or DAU. The ability to withstand and recover from attacks and compromises on systems. That's what we're talking about today, because if anyone comes and says, hey, look, I'm going to keep everyone bad out, that's just a fallacy. You can keep a lot of bad stuff out, but you can never guarantee that you're going to keep everyone bad out. And increasingly, we've seen more and more and more attacks. AI is helping phishing and smishing get significantly better. You're now using AI to run through source code and find vulnerabilities, right? What's called polymorphic malware, the ability to change its signature each time to make it harder to detect on the way in. And people are even using brand new IoT devices and other ways of infiltrating the enterprise. I heard about one very innovative attack that got in through the connected coffee pot. So yes, an employee brought in an IoT device, a connected coffee pot into the office, connects it, puts it on the internet, boom. Here's a new attack vector for bad actors to break in. One of the most innovative attacks I heard about was a bad actor put malware on a USB stick, put the company's logo on the USB stick, and scattered them around the parking lot. Employees drive up, say, hey, this is really cool. I don't have a company USB stick. Pick it up, bring it into the office, plug it in, boom. Right? Lots and lots and lots of different ways to break in. How do you make sure that after they break in, it's detected, it's stopped before bad stuff actually happens? It's a directive from the White House and the US government to go implement this level of cyber resiliency, right? You can sit there and read that direct quote. This is obviously, from a different administration, in 24, right? But we cannot make our infrastructure impervious to every threat. Instead, we have to make it resilient. That's what we're talking about. So in order to make it resilient, we have to think about how do attacks actually work, right? Before we get there, right, zero trust is a name that's thrown about a whole bunch of times. So I wanted to try and clarify zero trust and cyber resiliency really are almost two sides of the same coin. They share many notions about cyber threats, where cyber resiliency is motivated by this notion of, how do I make sure I can see and withstand, detect, and mitigate before it happens. Zero trust is more focused on the prevention side, right? They're both focused in the same kind of area, two sides of the same coin. Oftentimes the two are merged into one, but they are two slightly different things. So let's talk about how attacks work. And it's first off, somehow they break into your enterprise. Maybe it's a phishing email that wasn't recognized by the target. Maybe it was that connected coffee pot that I just mentioned. Maybe it was that USB stick that I just mentioned. Maybe it was the law firm. Some new SaaS app that you're utilizing inside your enterprise got infiltrated. We've all heard about supply chain attacks and other kinds of aspects. So many different ways to breach the enterprise. We read about new critical systems that need to be patched every single day, and most recently the stolen source code from F5. Had a conversation with the NSA. This is what bad actors do. They actually have a database of everywhere they can get this information, every organization, and all the different third parties and versions that third party uses. So when a new zero-day flaw gets published, they can immediately just go through their database and say, these are the people who have this system, who have this version. Let's go see if they've patched it yet. And they can do those attacks faster than anyone can actually patch their systems. So attacks are going to break in. What's the next step that happens after an attack breaks in? Well, think of an attack as planting an enemy spy behind enemy lines, right? You got in, you go, hey, I made it. What do you want me to do? Where do you want me to go? What do you want me to steal? If you fished against Sally on Sally's laptop, and I apologize if there's anyone on the call named Sally that I'm picking on, but if you fish Sally on Sally's laptop, encrypting Sally's laptop doesn't do any good. You need to go explore the organization. You need to go find the data that you want to go steal and hold for ransom and sell to other people. All of that requires communication between your digital spy inside the organization and the bad actor who's outside the organization. How does that communication work? It's digital communication to what's called command and control, right? And command and control, think of it as a domain or a set of infrastructure that the bad actor created somewhere out on the internet. And so messages get passed between that digital spy inside your organization and the bad actor's command and control outside your organization. So let's think about that for a second. If you're looking at all of the communication that's coming out of your organization, and you know what's good and bad, what's adversary controlled and what isn't on the internet, well then all of a sudden, as soon as that bad actor starts to reach out and try and talk, you can cut it off at the knees. You can stop that communication. sit there and say, look, we as an organization, we've never talked to domains in Pakistan before. Why all of a sudden are we talking to domains in Pakistan? What's going on? Is this allowed? Should this happen? All these different kinds of things. And so once you stop that communication, sure, the digital spy is still inside your organization, but they don't know what to do. They can't get instructions. They can't send data out. They can't explore your organization. So you give your IT team now time to go clean up that infection and fix Sally's laptop before any damage actually ensued. And now that you understand where it was talking to, with advanced intelligence, you can sit there and say, well, if that's what they use to try and talk today, here's what they're going to do tomorrow. Here's what they're going to do the next day. And you can now start to actually get ahead of the bad actors who are trying to breach your enterprise. It's all by understanding that regardless of how they break in, regardless of whether they're using AI today or not to write better phishing emails and better malware, it still needs to communicate out for data exfiltration, for instructions, all these kinds of things. And so if you watch the communication going out and you understand what is and isn't good on the internet, what is adversary controlled infrastructure on the internet, then you can actually get proactive and implement this level of cyber resiliency. Because if you understand, again, what is adversary controlled infrastructure on the internet, now it's no more just in time, hey, the FBI says we should block these things. No, you can get ahead of that. It's no more cat and mouse. Well, here's what they did today and here's what they did tomorrow, and I'm constantly behind the curve. No, you can get ahead of the curve. And you can protect organizations against attacks, both techniques and tactics that haven't even been invented yet. Because again, tomorrow they're going to create a brand new way to infiltrate your environment. But that brand new way of infiltrating your environment is still going to rely on communication out to some command and control that the bad actor controls. And so that's this notion of what we call adversary infrastructure intelligence. Infrastructure intelligence about what is good and what is bad on the internet and the power that can come from that. Because every single cyber attack, every single instance of digital fraud, whether it's digital fraud or money laundering or whatnot, even aspects of human trafficking, child exploitation, all of it uses internet infrastructure for command and control, for messages, for data storage, all these kinds of aspects. So if you understand what the adversary is doing on the internet, what infrastructure they are creating and they own, where is it in the world, how's it been accessed, and I don't mean they claim it's in London because they're using a VPN. No, where is it really in the world? Then you can now start to have significant power to make your organizations resilient against what's going to happen to it, right? And we, brief comment about HYAS. HYAS has customers that use adversary infrastructure for all of these use cases, even anti-child exploitation and anti-human trafficking kinds of stuff. This notion of infrastructure intelligence helps organizations uncover not the complete campaign architecture, not just a single slice. About 18 months ago, Uber was attacked 3 times in 1 year. Absolutely nobody believes it was 3 separate, unrelated attacks. What was it? Bad actor got in and left various back doors for them to exploit later. And this notion of infrastructure intelligence, rather than focusing on exactly what they do today, helps you broaden the understanding of what else does this adversary control? What else does this adversary doing on the internet? What are they going to use against me tomorrow and the next day and the next day, right? And in that way helps organizations enable early detection of future attacks or future attack attempts kinds of stuff. As we'll talk about in a second, one of the great things about adversary infrastructure intelligence, you can use it by itself, or you can easily incorporate it into all the other aspects of your stack to increase overall efficacy of your overall cybersecurity solution, right? And in doing so, better understand what's called actor tradecraft. What do these actors do? Continually understanding how I correlate all this data across all the other data that I have, right? Which is why one CISO in the US sat there and said, hey, look, I have a lot of tools. This was a CISO who was running a multinational billion-dollar organization who told me he had 56 billion, B with a B, attack things to investigate a quarter. 56 billion. He said, I have a ton of tools. Adversary infrastructure is the glue that connects all these different tools together, right? Now, what did he really mean by that? How does it connect all these other tools together? Well, let's talk about some of these specific examples, right? How do people today achieve, use adversary infrastructure intelligence to achieve cyber resiliency with something called protective DNS? Okay. Let's make sure we're clear. What is DNS? I assume most people know, but let's back up. DNS obviously is that system that converts domain names to IP addresses. So when you type in CNN.com, right, how do you get an IP address so the computer knows how to go find it, kinds of stuff, right? Well, protective DNS now adds a security layer on top of that and says not just what's the IP address for CNN.com, but should I give you that IP address? Or do I know that this is actually owned by a bad actor? Now let's talk about that phishing example, right? I'm sorry, Sally. Sally got that phishing email, didn't realize it was a phishing email, clicked on the link. Protective DNS is the thing that says, hey, you don't actually want to go there, and I'm not going to let you go there because I'm not going to give you an IP address for it. That digital spy broke into the organization and it tries to sit there and say, hey, I'm alive. What do you want me to do? Protective DNS is the thing that says, no, I'm not going to let this communication go out of the organization, and therefore that digital spy can never communicate with the bad actor, right? It identifies the communication that's going on with risky domains and stops that malicious activity before it really gets started. In doing so, improves the security of all the assets, which is why it's not only recommended by the US government, but it's recommended by governments around the world and is being implemented, as we speak, kind of stuff, right? And we'll talk about a couple of examples of that. But we also have other examples where people use adversary infrastructure to get proactive in their investigations on what's going on. Now let's talk about that for a second, right? Look, everything on the internet ends up being interconnected. And, for instance, when you create new infrastructure, you have to use an email address, you have to use a phone number, you have to register it someplace, you have to use a credit card or some payment methods or all these different kinds of things. And bad actors have various tradecraft of what emails they use and what phone numbers they use and how they register it and where they register it and all these different kinds of aspects. Everything on the internet ends up being interconnected in some way, shape, or form. And investigations, whether it's done by law enforcement or a SOC team or a cyber analyst or whatnot, investigations are fundamentally just follow the dots on various data points. Hey, look, Sally got phished. All I have is this email address. Okay, from that email address, how do I go to, an IP address? How do I go to, domain names? How do I go to, how do I go to where this is in the world, et cetera, right? And one of the questions that came in on chat was, well, hey, what about, things that don't have DNS records? Here's the interesting thing. In order for that digital spy to communicate with the bad actor, it has to communicate out, right? And there's two ways of communicating out. One is you hard code an IP address, here's where you go communicate. Or two is you use DNS to say, go look it up. Over 93% of all attacks use DNS because it's super easy to simply block a given IP address at your firewall and that attack is done. And the reason they use DNS is because you can constantly change where it is. You can constantly change what its IP address is. There's now malware that's called DGA or digital or dynamic generation algorithm that constantly changes the DNS, all these different kinds of aspects. but it has to be on the open internet so that it can be communicated with. And, the dark web is great for hiding secrets, but it's not good for how do I, when I'm randomly inside Citrus's network, how do I go communicate with my bad actor? It has to be on the open internet to go do so. And so this notion of investigations and follow the dots of various data points, that's what happens when you start with one identifier and now you build out and everything becomes interconnected using this notion of adversary infrastructure intelligence. Everything else becomes visible because that infrastructure and those domains have to be, number one, created before the attack or fraud is committed, and two, as we just talked about, created on the open internet where they're DNS visible. That allows investigators to move from reactive, what happened, hey, Sally got phished, here's where it came from, to proactive, hey, here's what these bad actors are going to go do next. And as I also mentioned, it's not just specific solutions that can use adversary infrastructure, but it can improve the efficacy of everything else, right? If you think about a typical EDR or XDR, Microsoft Defender for Endpoint or CrowdStrike or whatever, look, it's really good at identifying what's happening in memory and in real time on that machine. In general, they have no knowledge about, hey, is it creating a DNS request to someplace it shouldn't? We've added, in many cases, this infrastructure intelligence into the EDR to create a much more effective solution. You can integrate it into your SIEM, into your firewall, into your, all of your stack can actually be improved by having additional information about what bad actors are doing. And so let's talk about a few real world examples. This is a large hospital. It's very well known in the United States. I'll simply say associated with a tier 1 university. They have more than just people. They have a variety of IT devices. They often call them workstations on wheels, right? You may have seen these. You go into the doctor's office, they wheel in some computer, they walk in, they walk out. Look, yeah, it has a password on it, but is it really secure? How do they know, whether or not it's being accessed inappropriately? Did I log out appropriately? All these different kinds of things. You can't typically run maybe your standard software on it, etc., right? They had 23, today they have over 30,000 endpoints. A couple of years ago, they all of a sudden realized that they were under attack. And I'll mention HYAS there. They reached out to HYAS. Their CISO contacted me and said, I promise we will do a contract over the next 45 days, but I need to deploy your solution right now. And the solution they wanted was protective DNS, because what they were seeing was they had various workstations on wheels that were making inappropriate outbound requests, whether that's going to Russia and it shouldn't, whether that's going to adversary infrastructure and it shouldn't, all those kinds of things. They needed a way to globally control that, to clamp down on their cyber resiliency. Across these 23,000 endpoints, it was deployed in under 30 minutes. They were up and running. Wow. A second example, let's talk about a law firm, right? Completely different vertical, right? They have, about, over 1,000 employees, kinds of stuff, right? And these employees are traveling all over the place, right? They all have laptops. Sure, the company issues the laptop, and yes, maybe that laptop is running Microsoft Defender for Endpoint or CrowdStrike or something, right? But sometimes they're inside the corporate environment. Sometimes they're on the VPN. Sometimes they're sitting at Starbucks, right? How do they figure out how they protect these environments and protect these laptops regardless of where the employee is? Again, it's this notion of protective DNS, sitting there saying, hey, look, I don't care where in the world you are. I don't care what network you're on. But we're going to look at every outbound request that's coming off of your laptop and understand, should this be allowed or should this not be allowed? And when we see something that shouldn't be allowed, A, we're going to stop it. B, we're going to generate an alert so that IT can go dig in and sit there and say, what's going on your machine and how do we go prevent this, right? That's how they implemented in a very quick fashion security for a set of traveling professionals who may or may not even be tech savvy, right? These people are lawyers, right? They may not focus on technology. They may not focus on cybersecurity. This is seamless under the covers. Let's just make sure that nothing, if something bad gets onto this machine, that nothing bad can get off of this machine. Let's talk about a couple other real world examples, and then I'll summarize and happy to open it up for questions. There's I won't mention its name. Let's just refer to it as a global bank, right? And one of the things that they need to spend a lot of time focused on is anti-money laundering, AML, if you're not familiar with that acronym, and tracking of funds. Where is money going to? Well, they had an interesting challenge. And, we talked about this notion of adversary infrastructure intelligence, not just being who created it and who's accessing it, but where is it in the world? There's lots of ways to obfuscate location. And, I'm sitting here in Austin, Texas. I can configure my VPN to pretend like I'm at home. I have a VPN that allows me to go out my home network, so it seems like I'm sitting in my house. I have a VPN that would allow me to pretend I'm in Canada or pretend I'm in London or all these different kinds of aspects, right? Adversary infrastructure intelligence gets under the covers and says, I don't care where they're pretending to be. Where is this infrastructure actually? Because if you're trying to track, hey, is this money going to Iran or not? You need to understand those things. Well, they used adversary infrastructure intelligence. They were tracking funds and money flows on the internet with IP addresses. So they're tracking the IP addresses. They got actual geolocations for those IP addresses. They ended up comparing, interestingly enough, those IP addresses to global shipping records and proved that these transactions were happening on and off of a Russian oligarch's yacht as he sailed around the Atlantic. And they now understood exactly where that money was coming from and where it was flowing to and all these other kinds of things so that they could now implement banking policies and go the next step, right? Let's talk about one of the credit cards that I am 99% sure is in everybody's wallet today. They had a big problem, and this was 6 years ago, but they were being hit to the tune of $1 million a day worth of fraud. And it was coming out of micropayments, coming out of a video game called Fortnite. If anyone has younger kids, you've probably heard and seen about this video game. But $1 million a day worth of fraud coming out of Fortnite. You can imagine that adds up pretty quickly, even for, a billion-dollar credit card company. Using adversary infrastructure intelligence allowed them to, number one, identify the IPs, the domains, where it was coming from, so I can first and foremost stop it. But second, then even go the next layer and sit there and say, well, it's more than just how do I stop it? How do I figure out who was actually behind it? Generate enough information to hand a package over to Interpol so that arrests were actually made in the field. In this case, this is a US-based, credit card company, obviously global in nature. The bad actors were actually in Southeast Asia. Interpol successfully made a number of arrests, and various people were brought to justice. This was, again, in the very early days of HYAS. I was told that as a very small startup, our company name was the only startup known by the executives at this credit card company because of the significant impact it had on the bottom line. Let's talk about a global Fortune 50 company. I mentioned that quote earlier, and I'll just expand on that a little bit more. He said he was getting 56 billion different things to investigate a quarter. Right? They're not necessarily all attacks, but look, when you're a global company, you get all kinds of pings on your firewall, all kinds of scans. Bad actors are constantly trying to figure out what infrastructure you're using, what new entry points there might be. Hey, have they set up a new connected coffee pot yet? Do they have some brand new camera that I can go hack, right? If you think about every new IoT device, first comes out with functionality, then it gets hacked, then people figure out how to put cybersecurity in. You may remember 4 or 5 years ago, the Eastern Seaboard, the internet was brought down. And the way it was brought down was people did a denial of service attack by hacking a bunch of different Nest cameras, right? And so every single new IoT device and all these kinds of things ends up being functionality first, security later. Even when we go back before cybersecurity, who remembers the creation of the first automatic garage door opener, right? Worked great until everyone realized that, hey, there's like 10 different frequencies, so I can just drive up and down the street and see who else's garage door I can now open with my remote. That's when they added security back in, right? And so especially these global companies with hundreds and thousands of employees, as employees bring in brand new IoT stuff that I got for my birthday present, my Christmas present, my, this, that, or the other thing, right? Creates all these new entry points for bad actors, right? And so he had 56 billion kind of things to investigate a quarter. And he said to me, look, David, he goes, nobody has the staff to actually do that. But by piping all these things through adversary infrastructure intelligence, I could very, very quickly triage and figure out which ones I really need to investigate and send through a set of other tools and which ones I can ignore. He said he got 70% reduction on that just at a triage phase by utilizing adversary infrastructure intelligence in an automatic way. That was then what allowed him to staff and a size appropriate team to actually figure out what really is a threat. What do I really need to go do? How do I really need to protect my company? Right? But different examples of using adversary infrastructure intelligence, either for protective DNS and this notion of automatic protection, or various different investigations, whether it's fraud, whether it's real threat, or whether it's, child exploitation and anti-human trafficking and other kinds of things. And all of this is why, and this is my last slide, so I'm happy to open it up for questions. All of this is why we sit there and say knowledge is power. And so what is that knowledge? It's the knowledge of what adversaries are doing on the internet. Because again, before they can launch that attack, before they can commit that fraud, before they can move that money, they have to set up infrastructure to allow it. So if you have that adversary infrastructure intelligence, it allows these organizations to move from reactive to proactive. It allows them to implement this notion of cyber resiliency in a world where they know that bad things are going to happen and they simply need to be as prepared for it as possible. And so appreciate everyone's time.